Gun violence in the US is not just a public health problem, it is actually a public health epidemic. And what we're seeing is that it's really getting worse over time. So if you compare the number of mass shootings and the victims of gun violence this year in 2023 compared to 2020 before the COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing that there is an increase in gun violence that's occurring earlier in the year and more aggressively. So not only is it early, the peaks are actually much higher. And the sobering statistics are really that we have actually had, more mass shootings where more four individuals have died in 2023 than we have had days. So to me, that is just an alarming statistic that tells us just how bad the gun violence epidemic has become. And if you think about the impact of gun violence on public health, it's not just, of course, the people that we sadly lose during gun violence episodes, but it's also all the fallout that happens to the observers of the gun violence. And we're talking about mental health impacts, substance use, PTSD, anxiety, depression. We're talking about economic impacts on these individuals, changes in their jobs, in their behavior, in their workflow. We're talking about impacts on our kids and their academic learning. And then, of course, even the physical impacts, higher blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, less chronic disease management. So it's really creating a domino effect on all the other aspects of our life. And we need to wake up and address this problem. This dramatic increase has led to more research looking at these. And what we found is that partially the pandemic does have to contribute to this because a lot of people lost their jobs, more people started using substances. And so some of the effects of the pandemic could certainly be why we're seeing such a sharp increase in gun violence. But what we're seeing is that the pandemic also contributed to it through access. So we saw a really sharp steep in the number of, people buying guns, gun ownership in the United States occurring early in 2020, and it's sort of sustained ever since then. So not only did it change our behavior and our perception and how we approach gun violence, but it also increased access to guns. And these seem to be sort of the two main drivers of why this sharp increase has been seen. Now, a lot of people talk about mental health driving gun violence, and certainly there is a subset of gun violence deaths that occur as a result of mental health. But really, if you look at other countries that have similar incidences of mental health problems, you're not seeing the same impact of gun violence on the population as a whole because that access piece is not there. So I really do think that a big part of this problem is the access, and the pandemic has just sort of catapulted us into this state of mind where people feel that perhaps they need to own a gun, or perhaps they're in an economic or social or behavioral state that leads them more likely to engage in gun violence. I think we really need to step up, acknowledge it, and address it, because if we don't, it's going to continue to have an impact, not just on us, on our kids as well. And data emerging is showing us, of course, that gun violence is now the #1 preventable cause of death in kids and adolescents. But what's even more disturbing than that is that it actually impacts their neurocognitive development. So if you have a child that's exposed to gun violence directly or indirectly through the media, through the news, or actually witnessing a school shooting, they're likely to develop more aggressive behaviors. They're likely to actually use violence to solve conflict rather than using nonviolent means. So we're changing the generations ahead. So, as a physician, I think just like we deal with any other problem, whether it's hypertension or diabetes or lipid management, the first and most important thing is awareness, is for us to acknowledge that it's a problem and really try to identify some of the root causes. In my opinion, one of the biggest root causes is access. The second piece of this is to really address education. So if you can't change the access, people are going to get guns because of the political climate of our country. We need to educate them about gun safety, because we know that a lot of the deaths that happen, especially in kids and adolescents, are accidental deaths, perhaps even. So how to store your gun, how to keep your gun safe, how to talk to your kids about gun safety, how to talk to your teenagers about that. So those are all the things that I think we need to really talk to our kids about, and to adults. And then I think the last piece of this is that the physicians actually need to take ownership on this as a public health problem as well. So it is something that I plan to address with my patients during every one of my visits with them. And I hope that other physicians, regardless of their specialty, will do the same, because that is something that we also need to as physicians educate and empower people to understand the impacts of gun ownership, of gun violence, and how it's changing the health of our country.